Okay, in chapter 18 we discussed the passive system. We have it separated out from the active middle forms outside of the first principal part. If you remember well, the first principal part treats both the active and middle passive system. Once we come out of the first principal part and we get to the second and third principal part, remember that we only saw the active and middle voices. The passive system was reserved for separate principal parts. The fourth is for the perfective active, and so we find the passive system represented here in the sixth principal part. This is precisely because it builds an entirely different system. Now, this is exegetically very interesting once we can recognize the passive system, because of course this affects agency. Alright, so in addition to the tense, stem, and your verb action kind, we also need to pay attention to who is performing the action. Okay, so we are going to learn about the aorist passive and the future passive, and both are found in the sixth principal part. So we have, just as a recap, three voice suffixes. The sixth principal part gives us the aorist and future passive. They're both undefined action, that's what they have in common, and they are established, developed if you will, by using a voice suffix, and so that's how the sixth principal part is created. So starting with the aorist, that means, since it's aoristic, that we expect an augment for action time indication, since we are in the indicative. We do not yet see reduplication. Of course we have box number 3, the tense stem, and then we see what we call the voice suffix. In this case it's the theta eta for the aorist passive. Since it has that eta, we do not see a thematic vowel, kind of like with your sigma alpha for the regular aorist, the first aorist. It has inherently included in there kind of a thematic vowel. And then we have the action performer, your inflection, and that's a secondary ending. So just to recap, the aorist passive is the sixth principal part. Remember, same rules here, compounds, hide, augments, because you will also here encounter augments, because all that's different here is the voice. So the basic building blocks are the same except for your voice suffix. So here you see it, your voice suffix here without the inflection. It's very distinctive. You are totally going to recognize the theta eta. Remember our little slide presentation? Theta eta, theta eta, theta eta. So whenever you see theta eta, you need to have a knee-jerk response and say, oh, oops, that's an aorist passive. Now, that means that we have a theta, and that's a dental kind of sound. So we're going to have some stop interactions, right? Because it's a consonant, and so you have a different kind of airflow. So we're going to have what we call theta stop interactions. We've already seen sigma stop interactions. So you have your same square of stops, but this time we add the theta to it from the theta eta. So notice that the reaction, as Stephen says, is patterned. The first two labials, pi and beta, become the third. So whenever you have a pi or a beta, right before your theta eta, you see that it becomes the phi, okay, or phi as the Americans say. Then your palatals, your kappa, your gamma, and your chi. Here you add your theta to that, it also becomes the third one, and same for your dentals, it becomes, and it resorts to the third one. In this case it will resolve to a sigma. Okay, so all dentals convert to that sigma. Now what if they encounter a liquid, the other group of troublemakers? It's pretty consistent. It likes to put a vowel in there to just kind of spread out the sound, so it's not so hard to go from a liquid to the theta. So a long eta in there. Or sometimes it says, I'm okay, I'll sit there. Though at times the nu will simply drop out. The nu is often the dropper outer, right? I must say that rho theta rarely is seen though. Okay, so you pick up on it. Now, so how does this work out? Take for example Hempo. So that means that we have a pi in the stem. Once you take your omega off, your first person singular in your lexical entry, and we turn it into the aorist passive, it means that we're going to add an augment, right? Then we're going to add our theta eta, and oops, that means that you're going to have a theta stop interaction, right? So the pi is going to encounter the theta. So that means we have the labial interaction. The pi is going to resort to becoming the final labial sound. So it's going to be a P, and sure enough, we end up having a, okay, or shorter sounds, you know, a pempsthe, right? So same from bulamai, a bulethe. So we have a liquid there, right? And so we insert along eta sound there. Of course, it's followed by your inflection. Crino, from I judge. What has happened here? Well, you can tell. Nu, likewise, is a liquid. Instead of here of adding an eta in between the nu and the theta, the nu simply has dropped out. Something else here. Soon ago, same thing has happened, right? The gamma encountered a theta, so we have a theta stop reaction. Something else has happened here as well. Do you see that long eta? Well, that's because this is a compounded form. And so remember, we have an aorist passive, so we have an augment. And so that short alpha encountered a short epsilon, and alpha and epsilon together elongated, lengthened to an eta. All right. Now remember, we need to have inflections, and this is interesting because the aorist passive tense, of course, as an aorist takes secondary endings, but here's an exception. Even though it's a passive, it takes the active endings. Don't ask me why. This is something that developed in the Greek language. So that's a little different here. If you look down here, you see the active endings added to a passive. But that's the only exception that you will have to realize. Of course, we also have the deponents. You're aware of that. Now, we also find the passive in the future. So the future passive, because it works off the same voice suffix, we find them in the same principal part. So also first connection here, you find them here called first passive. Notice, of course, we don't have an augment because it's not past time. So we start with box number 3, the tense stem. Then we have our voice verb tense suffix, theta eta, and it incorporates also then the tense suffix, which is the sigma from the future, and it together then forms theta eta sigma. Now we no longer have the eta exposed, so we will have to use the thematic vowel. And the good news is we are in fact using passive inflective endings here, as opposed to what we saw with the theta eta, the aorist passive. All right, so we call this the future first passive stem. Okay, so theta eta sigma, when you see that, you have a knee-jerk response and say, oops, that's a future passive. So now the only thing that, of course, we need to keep in mind is when we translate something passively, we must indicate that there is a sense of outside agency. So whereas for the aorist first passive, we said I was loosed, you were loosed. The indication is that some outside force is doing it, right? And notice we don't say I was being loosed, because that would insinuate an ongoing action, and it's undefined. So it's a little tricky to translate that. For the future, however, we render the future sense, so I shall or will, and then we say be loose because there's no risk of making it sound durative. So you give this undefined rendering there, but you get this idea it's an outside agent that will do this in a future time because it's in the indicative here. Okay. Now then we also have second passives, both for the aorist and the future, and that has solely to do with the voice suffix. This is not to be confused with first and second aorist tense forms. Okay, this is the voice suffix. So a second passive loses the theta of the theta eta. It's just a recognition sort of thing. So a grapsthe from grapho is one of those. Notice that it loses the theta. That's simply what happens. You have to learn this by observation. And so notice that's a little hard to recognize, and you just have to learn this from encountering it. The reason it's important to observe it is you want to be sure to translate it with a sense of passive agency so that we recognize that an outside agency here does the writing. Okay, so the same then is true for the second passive for the future, and that builds off the aorist second passive in this case. So the theta eta sigma loses the theta as well. This one is a little easier to spot because you hold on to the longer eta. And so here you go again. It's a little hard to not confuse this, of course, but the good news here is that you have a passive ending. So it's a little easier here to hold on to that. All right, and that's it.